I liked it so much, I bought the company.
That's a chap by the name of Victor Khayyam, and that was his saying that he used in the advertising of the products that his company's made. It was Remington shavers in particular that made him famous, although he used the slogan on other products across the years. Anyway, as a motorcycle journalist by trade and not a regular purchaser of companies, I feel that with a little massaging, I liked it so much I bought the motorcycle is applicable in this moment. For very nearly 3 decades, I have been privileged enough to ride and review new bikes as a job. During that time, I have obviously owned several of my own bikes, and I like to think that each one, given my profession, is a resounding endorsement of a particular model. Currently, my meagre resources have been directed Yamaha's way, thanks to this MT-09. It's a 2021 model, although I did buy it in 22 because I preferred these colours to those that they released last year. Given that I wanted a brand new naked sport bike, and given that I couldn't afford to spend more than 10,000 euros or so, about 170 to 180,000 rand, I decided, hold on a minute. It's the latest exchange rate news. Apparently that's now 195,000 rand for 10,000 euros. Oh, good. Excellent. Anyway, based on my own reviews, the MT-09 was the no-brainer option. A simple decision in many respects, and I didn't hesitate for a second as I hunted down this grey example of the breed. It's about 8 months now since I did the deed, and I have been very, though not perfectly happy, ever since. At the time, if I had had 14,000 or so euros available, or about 270,000 rand, I would have bought a fully spec'd KTM 890 Duke R, and if I got 23,000 euros, or about 450,000 rand, it would probably have been the 1290 Super Duke R. But I didn't have that sort of money. I had 10 grand, and so even at a stretch, KTM standard 890 Duke didn't compete as far as I was concerned. Honda's CB1000 was too expensive, Suzuki's GSX-S 1000 also out of my league, Kawasaki has the very lovely Z900, but I'm not into the looks, the electronics aren't on anywhere near the same level, the handling is not as sweet, and the engine, though more powerful, not quite as entertaining off the spec sheet as on it. And then there is the Triumph Street Triple, which is an epic bike in RS form. And even in the slightly detuned and dumbed down R version that is affordable, it's worth a look, but ultimately still too expensive and too frenetic and track oriented compared to the Yamaha. And so it was a relatively easy decision, except for the one bike out of left field that made me think more than the others put together, and much more than I thought it ever would. And that's because real life kept encroaching on my desires for a bike that could fulfill my needs and desires as the only bike in my garage, or more accurately, on my trailer. I say out of left field, but that's not because it's unusual in any way, it's because it's the most sensible, straight down the middle, almost boring contender in this class. I'm talking about this bike, BMW's F900R. Let's make no bones about it. Money no object, this doesn't even make it anywhere near my shortlist. But back in the real world, it kept popping up on that list no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. Let me try and explain why, and at the same time allow me to revisit these two very similar yet also markedly different bikes and see whether I made the right decision after all. I chose the Yamaha when I parted with my cash because ultimately it is a more exciting bike to ride. That's because the 890cc cross-plane cranked inline triple delivers a very entertaining 117 horsepower and just over 93 Newton meters. The engine sits in a package that weighs a respectably feathery 190 kilograms wet and ready to roll, and keeps control of its wheels with a fully adjustable fork and a rear shock on which you can fiddle with preload and rebound damping. There's a 6-axis IMU that gives you lean angle sensitive traction control and braking, and there's even an anti-slide control that is in addition to the traction control, and there's front wheel lift control as well, anti-wheelie if you prefer. A lot of complex electronic rider-aideriness for a budget middleweight naked sport bike, and for that you can thank Yamaha for lifting the IMU from the R1 and leaving it surprisingly feature-laden in this more affordable guise. Oh, and as standard there's a both ways quick shifter that is one of the best I've ever used, regardless of a bike's price bracket. Overall, the electronics on the MT-09R, I'm pretty sure just about the best in class, even taking into account a fully optioned KTM 890 Duke, although I have to admit I do miss the KTM's ability to remove the ABS from the rear wheel only, for no reason other than to behave like a child occasionally and possibly practice a bit of mild backing it in braking. This engine may be outstanding in terms of pure numbers, but it's even more impressive in the flesh, so to speak. It's always up for a blast. It doesn't mind if you're caning it to the red line or if you prefer to rely on its mid-range guts. It always delivers an instant, intoxicating surge of forward motion. This is probably the greatest improvement over the previous versions of the MT-09. There's a degree of control and feel through the throttle that never used to be here. On or off were your options in the past, and the transition between the two was as subtle as a Tyson Fury jab to the face. Now, well, you can choose how snappy and instant you want your throttle, and all three options are very usable. On top of an engine that can now, I think, be regarded as one of the greats, there's a balance and accessibility to the way the chassis goes about its business that means whatever level of skill and experience you've got, the Yamaha will give you the sort of handling responses you're looking for. It might well be the cheapie in the middleweight naked class, but it really punches way above its price point. If you like to ride pretty hard on the road, then there are few bikes that can deliver so much fun quite so easily. Certainly not this BMW, that's for sure. It's nowhere near as playful. It has a much more serious, sensible outlook on life, but that's not to say you can't enjoy its less in-your-face approach to zipping through a few twists and turns. In terms of power and weight, the F900 has clearly lost the spec sheet war because its 895cc parallel twin is a dozen horsepower down on the MT, although it just about matches the torque output, and as a bonus it makes that peak lower in its range at 6,500 RPM. The Yamaha's maximum is delivered a bit later at 7,000 RPM. As for the kilo contrast, the curb weight is quoted at 211 kilograms, a not inconsiderable 21 kilos heavier than the Yamaha's ready-to-ride weight with a full tank of fuel, which is 190 kilograms. In practice, you might expect the BMW to feel a little bit gutsier off the bottom end, and maybe it is right at the bottom, like just off idle bottom end, but otherwise, I have to say the Yamaha feels peppier in the low to mid range, and then once you're up past about 6,000 RPM, it's all over. The Yamaha is in a different league entirely. It just growls off to the red line with gusto, as if it's desperate to please you with how quickly it can get there. The F900 keeps climbing through the final third of its range, but
It all feels like it's under protest. It'll do it, but it's not thrilled about the prospect. If there was an extra 10 horsepower available in those higher reaches of the rev counter, it would transform this bike's character.
There is one performance area though in which the BMW definitely does outdo the Yamaha, and that's in the quality of the suspension, at least in this higher spec version that comes with the dynamic ESA at the rear. Having adjustability at the prod of a button when you want to go full sporty or if you want to take a passenger is a genuine luxury and is extremely practically useful. The front fork on the Beamer has no adjustment at all, but it still feels good whether you're tootling along a bumpy road 2 up or you're enjoying some serious lean angle when you're in the mood for a hoon. It's a very nicely compromised setup in that it seems to be able to deal with most of the stuff that you're ever going to throw its way. You can't say the same for the Yamaha suspension, at least not on this standard version. But perhaps pitting a SP model against the higher spec BMW might have been a fairer comparison. As it is, the MT-09's rear shock, adjustable for preload and compression damping, is passable on smooth roads, but it struggles to keep the rear tyre planted when the going gets a bit rough. The front is better, and it has the full range of adjustability to help you get the most out of it.
The upshot is that despite the weight handicap, the relatively soft power delivery and the completely unadjustable front end, the BMW actually feels much more sporty than you'd expect. It likes corners, it turns in confidently, you can trail brake without any horrible understeer, on the road at least, and it will swap from side to side also pretty easily. On top of which, it'll settle into some decent lean angle when it's not 4 degrees like it is now, and it will feel very reassuring while you enjoy its genuinely surprising handling package. If the engine seems a little reluctant to party, sort of somewhat middle-aged in its responses, the handling feels like it comes from a younger generation. The engine would be happy with a nice couple of pints before retiring to bed early, while the chassis, it's got more of a mind to chase every pint with a shooter and stay up later than is probably wise. I have to admit, I've really enjoyed hustling the F900 through some of these less than perfect Spanish backroads. It inspires confidence. It's just a shame that the motor is so breathless. You're as well short shifting on the torque because the revs, especially in the higher gears, seem to add more in the way of noise than much extra forward motion.
I've ridden the F900R several times in the nearly 3 years since it first arrived, and the handling is always a refreshingly rewarding experience. And the same can be said for the bike's electronics as well. The most obvious points regarding the electronics are all up here, namely this class-leading TFT screen and the switchgear that provides your access points to all the goodies. The screen is big, beautifully bright and clear. It's the same unit that you'll find on something like the 1250 GS or the 1000 XR. So on this much more affordable model, you have an important piece of technology designed for a bike that costs twice as much. Currently, I'm of the opinion that this is actually the very best in the business. I especially enjoy the extra sport screen you get where you can check your lean angles, braking pressure, throttle position, and have the rev counter in a more traditional central analog type display. If you try to keep an eye on it all while you're riding, you'll probably die. But apart from that minor inconvenience, it's quite good fun. The switchgear is also class leading. The materials used and the quality feel to how everything operates are the stuff of much more expensive models. It obviously made economic sense for BMW to not bother designing and manufacturing cheaper switches or even the TFT screen for this middleweight model. And so the F900R buyer is getting the experience of a truly top-notch rider bike interface at a relatively low price point. The MT switchgear is actually good quality as well. Not quite in the Beamer's league, but I have to say I'm more than satisfied as a long-term owner. Though I have to admit that the TFT screen at 3.5 inches is barely half the size of the BMW's and is a nasty, cheap-looking toy by comparison. Still, I'm okay with it generally. Would I like it to be larger, clearer? Yes, I would. Does it ruin the bike in any way for me? No, it does not. In terms of riding modes and adjustability of elements like braking and throttle response and the electric versions of slipper clutches that are engine braking control, it's pretty much of a muchness, although the Yamaha, I feel, has slightly more adjustability where it really matters. In this fully loaded configuration, the BMW also comes with remote tyre pressure monitoring and cruise control, both of which are nice to haves, but not essential. The F900 also gets an adaptive headlight that is lean angle sensitive. Oh yes, and another feature I'd love to have available for practical purposes, my own and my wife's peace of mind, is the SOS feature that allows you to call an operator to summon help, or if the bike is involved in an accident and you don't reply to the operator who calls, help will be sent. I know this works and sort of doesn't because it was activated through a fault, but a couple of years ago I had a fleet of German fire engines and police cars suddenly turn up at my location because the operator had been informed that the bike had taken a tumble. It hadn't. It was quite embarrassing actually at the time, but it's very reassuring to know that it can find you and send help should you be incapacitated. Unfortunately, I don't think this feature is actually available in South Africa. So then, decision time. Did I make the right choice a year ago when I bought the Yamaha? Yes, I did. Although the F900R does run it much closer than I anticipated. But the first disqualifying factor is that in this fully spec setup, it's about 2,000 euros more expensive than my Yamaha. Even taking into account the extras I put on my MT, the screen, heated grips, the tail tidy and the radiator guard. A more fair comparison would be to have lined up the SP version of the MT-09 with its higher quality suspension, and the verdict would have been even more clear, even though the engine, brakes and electronics are identical to the standard version.
The Yamaha is simply too much engine, and less so it's too much handling as well. The result is that it is clearly a lot more fun to ride and ride hard.
Are there things I'd like from the BMW on my MT? Yes. This TFT display, the switchgear, the Brembo brakes that, although far from being top-level Brembo equipment, still offer more feel, a more decisive initial bite and a bit more power than the pretty good but slightly wooden radial calipers on my bike. And the ESA, I want that. Being able to adjust effectively and noticeably for differing loads and riding requirements without getting out the toolkit is a massive winner. I'd like it front and rear actually, but at the price point that this BMW comes at, I can't really complain that it's only on the back. The Yamaha's detail finish as well isn't quite as good as this Beamer's, but I prefer its riding position, which is roomier for a tall person, especially in the leg area. I sometimes struggle with the lack of legroom on the F900, although it does feel good when you start riding harder. Although if I want to scoot back in the seat, I can't because there's not enough room before you hit the step up to the passenger seat. Conversely though, the pillion seat is much better on the BMW and there's more leg room. If taking a passenger is going to be a large part of your riding, then the F900 is definitely the way to go. Niggles on the BMW include the clunky quick shifter. It's good, as most of these systems are, at higher RPM, but it struggles much more than the Yamaha at low RPM. The back brake is also too spongy. There's too much travel and the ABS seems to kick in far too early. When I organised the F900 so I could back-to-back these two bikes, I was expecting to reach a much more resounding and emphatic conclusion. Ultimately, I did make the right decision. The Yamaha is the sportier bike. This CP3 inline triple is a gem of an engine, and that swings the pendulum too far in the MT-09's direction.
The F900's weak point is definitely its engine. It's not bad, it's just a bit too vanilla for my liking. But if someone in the M division at BMW got hold of it and packed in another dozen horsepower and gave it a top end that made chasing the red line a worthwhile effort, you'd have a much, much closer contest.
The F900R is a good bike, full of technology when fully spec'd up like this one is, but at this price point I'd be sorely tempted to go the SP route with the MT, or maybe a standard KTM 890 Duke with all the extras, or even the equivalent Triumph Street Triple.
I enjoyed the BMW on this test, I did, but, and it's a big but, I love this Yamaha. Now all I need to do is save some money and get me a better rear shock.